Hello, and thank you for joining me again today on the Finding Hope After Loss podcast. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. If you like the show, please leave a review or rating on Apple or Spotify. It only takes a moment and really helps the show reach more loss and infertility families. Today's organization spotlight is from Sarah with Pittsburgh Bereavement Doulas. Here's what she had to say. When parents receive the news that their baby has no heartbeat or will die shortly after birth, their life changes forever and will never be the same again. They are faced with so many questions and emotions in a short period of time, and having someone specialized in perinatal loss to help them navigate this traumatic experience is associated with less negative psychological outcomes. Who will sensitively care for these families experiencing the worst day of their life? Making the most of this time is one of the most important things we can do to help parents begin to process their grief. We present opportunities to make memories, care for the newborn, and plan funeral arrangements in a way grieving parents may not have thought of or thought possible. Our doulas support these families from diagnosis, during the entire birth, and through the first year. As they prepare the family to meet their baby who has passed or will shortly pass, they establish a trusting relationship with the family, which helps to ease their fears and open their hearts to welcome and parent their baby. It significantly changes the atmosphere from panic to peace. By establishing relationships with local hospitals and care providers and receiving referrals directly from doctors, nurses, and hospital social workers, for patients who are in need of our specialized and free doula services, we have created a program that affords these patients the opportunity for the highest level of bereavement care. The mission of Pittsburgh Bereavement Doulas is to support birthing persons and their loved ones who are experiencing pregnancy loss by providing compassionate guidance through the process of birth, meeting baby for the first time, making the time together meaningful, doing photography, and saying goodbye. We want parents to be left with as little regret as possible, given the overwhelming and often immediate situation. Like a traditional birth doula, they provide physical, emotional, and informational support during labor and birth, but have special training in perinatal loss. Bereavement doulas will work with parents to honor this birth and help them make decisions based on their unique values, beliefs, and preferences. With realistic optimism, doulas will explain what is happening, what is about to happen, and what could happen. More importantly, they have a passion to serve these families and are well equipped with a unique knowledge base to do so in a positive way. Thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing your organization with us. Today, I am talking with Lindsey, who is the founder of Pregnancy After Loss Support. She talks about the loss of her daughter, Nora, who was stillborn at 40 weeks, and how this led her to create PALS. She also talks about the launch of her new book, When Skies Are Gray, A Grieving Mother's Lullaby. Hello, everyone. Today, I am here with Lindsey, who is the founder of Pregnancy After Loss Support. Hi, Lindsey. How are you doing today?
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So for those who aren't familiar with you and with Pregnancy After Loss Support, do you want to just talk a little bit about how that came to be and, what that organization does?
Sure. So in 2012, I was pregnant with my first daughter and child, Nora, and sadly at 40 weeks and 4 days, that December, she was stillborn. We went to the hospital expecting to deliver a baby. We didn't have any indication that she was in distress or in trouble. And then we were told those horrible words that no parent should have to hear, which is, I'm sorry, there's no heartbeat. And then it was like a 180, like it switched from like that moment people talk about as the before, when everything was okay, into the after, when everything is so different and your new normal. So 12 hours later, we met Nora after she was born, and I held her and we said hello and goodbye in the same moment, in the same few hours. And then what kind of happened is I went deep into my grief after that. So that was 2012, 2013. And I'm a psychotherapist by trade, and I was at the time. I was working in a women's clinic focusing on sobriety and mental health. And so I had already been to therapy, like I'd been involved in therapy as a therapist, but I went to therapy for the first time after Nora died and started going to therapy for my grief. And then I started writing on a blog and journaling about my grief with her. And so writing became a huge part of my healing process. And then what happened along the way in my grieving is that I would use therapy tools I know I had for my own practice on myself, and then I would write about them in my blog. And then I kind of got picked up by Still Standing magazine. I don't know if you remember that one, Sarah. That was for bereaved parents and relatively new at the time. So for infertility, pregnancy loss, and infant death. And I wrote over there in my grief, which was very helpful for me processing things and finding community for sure. Like your web, or like your Instagram page and your dress, like it's so important to find community in that way, right? And become very
Yeah.
we create relationships that way. So then it's 2013, I become subsequently pregnant, which is very scary. I'm like I said, losing Nora was the hardest thing I ever did, but going through my subsequent pregnancy was the second hardest thing I ever did after letting her go. It was a really scary time, as you know. You have to hold grief and joy, hope and fear. I'm an anxious person by nature, so that doesn't help. Pregnancy after loss for an anxious person is really, really hard. It's hard for anybody, but it seems exponentially harder when you have a mind that's always thinking of the worst case scenario. And how can you not? So when you're in a subsequent pregnancy, we talk about how it's your anxiety is a normal response or an expected response for the abnormal experience of losing a baby in a traumatic way, right? So anxiety during a subsequent pregnancy is to be expected. And so I realized it was really hard, as most people do, and there wasn't a ton of resources that were focused just on the subsequent pregnancy. So I wrote for Pregnancy and Newborn magazine weekly as their kind of like weekly blogger. But it was a traditional national magazine, right? And so what I found out, and this is how PALS came to be, Pregnancy After Loss Support, is that when I wrote stories for Still Standing magazine, everybody was really raw and new in their grief. So they weren't ready to hear about hope of another pregnancy, right? Which is fair. I felt that way too. And then when I would share stories over in the Pregnancy and Newborn magazine world, which is just like anybody who's pregnant kind of headed over there for understanding pregnancy. And that group didn't want to hear about loss. So I felt like there wasn't a place for people like us. So when Zoe was born healthy and alive in March of 2014, in June of 2014 is when PALS was born. I had the idea of maternity leave because there wasn't a unique place for the experience of the subsequent pregnancy that talked just about that. A lot of bereavement organizations at the time had like a subset or foreign forums for subsequent pregnancies, but nobody focused just on that. Now there's lots of organizations, which is great. But at the time there wasn't. So I was like, I reached out to my other writer friends and I was like, would you want to write about, on a magazine? It was just supposed to be an online magazine, like The Bump, but for sad parents like us. And lots of people did. So I had the idea, but so many people came together to help make the organization what it is today, and they still do. So then Pregnancy After Loss Support, which we abbreviate to PALS, was born. And it's been going strong ever since. So Zoe turned 10 in March, which means in June, PALS will be 10. And that's how PALS came to be.
That's amazing. 10 years. My son actually, it's his birthday today, so he just turned 10. So I didn't realize ours were so close together, but that's amazing. Did you ever think that it would grow into what it is today?
No, I mean, I just had an idea and went with it, which is a lot of what I do. and then we'll see how it goes, right? But I do think because of like timing and the way the internet was at the time, like there wasn't like a lot of online groups yet, and like the Facebook groups were becoming pretty popular at the time. So we went from an online magazine to offering peer-to-peer support Facebook groups, which was revolutionary at the time, but now it's just like what happens. And then, you know, having more of a social media presence, doing educational outreach to providers at conferences like therapist conferences, mental health conferences, Plato, which I'm going to next week. You know, Pregnancy and Infant Loss Death Alliance for nurses and doctors, supporting those who are pregnant after loss. And so talking about the emotional experience that our group of parents would tell us they wanted through the PALS organization. And then we've shared that through like surveys and poster presentations and other things like that at conferences. So we did that. And then people wanted a walk. So we did that, the water walk, and that's been going on for 6 years, 5 years. I don't know. I'm not very good at numbers. And time seems to just flow together now. And then most recently in 2021, we launched the app, which is kind of our biggest accomplishment besides starting as an organization that we offer.
So many things. And I love being involved in everything. We've done the water walk for the past I think 4 years that we've done it. So, you know, throughout my pregnancy after loss, and then my pot of gold baby that I just had, we've done it every year. And I got her little shirt last year. And yeah, I love being part of it. And I was just so grateful that it wasn't right after we lost Jasmine, it was a little bit later that we found that I found PALS. But I'm just so grateful that I did. It helped me so much.
Yeah, and that just warms my heart to hear that, and that you continue to be involved. And you've been involved, like very involved with PALS for a long time now. So I appreciate your commitment to it, not just the walk, but other ways that you've supported us.
Thank you. I love being part of it. It makes me feel, that's why I wanted to be part of it, is because after my loss, I just felt like I needed to do something like to help other people. You just feel like, God, this really sucks. And other people are going through this too. So it's like, how can you help them? And that's what kind of led me, you know, in that direction. So
yeah. And then, I mean, your dress is just wonderful. I always think of like the sisterhood of the traveling pants, right?
yeah, I love that. Yeah, we're almost at all 50 states now. We've got like 4 states left and we'll hit all 50. So
Oh, I thought you just finished all of them because I was looking at your map the other day.
yeah, no, we're 4 short, but we even got Alaska. So that was kind of cool.
Nice. What are the 4 that we still need to get?
Maine, like Delaware, Wyoming, and I think Vermont was the last one.
Okay.
Yeah, we even have Montana, but not Wyoming. It's all just out there open. So yeah, if anybody wants to be part of it.
Yes, that out there right now. Maybe by the end of 2024.
Yes, that would be amazing. And so you are also coming out with a book, is that right?
Yeah, so my book launches at the end of May 21st, which is actually my husband's birthday and our anniversary. So I felt like it was kind of a sign that I was meant to publish with She Writes Press, who is my publisher. And so I started writing, it's called When Skies Are Gray, A Grieving Mother's Lullaby. Not everybody else can see it, but you can see it. Here it is. And it actually details, you know, my life a little bit before I got pregnant with Nora and how we kind of fell in love with her. And then, of course, her death, and then going through grief, and then getting subsequently pregnant again and going through that journey. So it's about losing Nora and then bringing Zoe into the world and how challenging both of those are. So it's written from the perspective of me reading a bedtime story to Nora, like an imagined Nora. So the first chapter is actually, after the introduction, is actually like me imagining telling her our love story. So, you know, she's asking me at the imagined age of 4 in the bedroom that was supposed to be her nursery. That was my kids' room for so many years. So I know what it's like when I'm writing this. And I probably picked 4 because I think Zoe was 4 when I started writing the book. And so I'm telling Nora our love story as we go through it.
It's like making me tear up over here. Like that's just such a sweet way to, you know, to go about it, because it's something we don't get to do with our babies.
Yeah. And I think everybody is asking me, like, how are you feeling now that it's out there? And I actually feel a little sad because I used writing the book as a way to continue parenting Nora. in her absence. So like when I wrote it after both of my subsequent children were born. And so Zoe was born with like, I don't know, I get numbers wrong, like 15 months after Nora died. Maybe it was 18. I can't remember. It's right in the book. And then Liev came soon after. Liev's only my youngest is, so Zoe and Liev are like 26 months apart. So, you know, after parenting young children, it was a way for me to not forget Nora and to like set aside a time to parent her and to think about her and to grieve missing her and wondering who she would have been, which is the name of the first chapter of the prologue. I wonder who you would have been. I probably picked age 4 though, imagined age, is because my children were that age when I was writing the book. Like Zoe was 4, Liev was 2. I wrote it when I lived in Germany for a year, starting in for my husband's work in 2018 to 2019. I wrote it from start to finish, but honestly, I had probably been writing it forever because it started out as the blog. And what was the blog? I would go back and research my life for what I wrote back then to understand how to frame it for a book, right? To tell the story from beginning to end. But then the pandemic hit and I had only 2 chapters left to write before I submitted it to publishers. But I didn't because, you know, pandemic. And then we actually went and lived over in the UK for 2 years for my husband's job again. And it wasn't until so I wrote the whole story in 2018 to 2019, but then I put it on pause. And then I came back to the last 2 chapters, which happened to be the traumatic chapters, right? The 2 chapters that I wrote last were actually about her death and then meeting her and saying goodbye to her. And I wrote those in 2022. January of 2022. So yeah, you don't write a book all at once. I mean, some people do, but for me, it's been a way to spend time with her. And so now that it's coming out into the world, I wonder, you know, how I'll get to spend time with her still.
I find that's something I struggle with too is, and I know a lot of lost parents do, is that we, you know, we're still trying to parent them and find ways to connect with them and bond with them. And sometimes it's hard to feel like we're being successful at that.
Yeah, I feel like that too. I mean, I guess pals can continue to be that way for me, because it always has been. I think doing remembrance walks or the dress project like you do are ways of doing it. But I also think you don't have to do large scale things. You can also, you know, there's a story I wrote when the kids were little that I performed on Listen to Your Mother, which is like a local read your story platform performance, and it's called The Invisible Motherhood. It's actually going to be on my website here soon for Mother's Day because it's about Mother's Day, the first Mother's Day after Zoe was here and Nora died. So it was my second without Nora. And I was wondering, like, am I going to forget her? Like, how do I still hold space for Nora in the busyness of taking care of Zoe, doing dinner, washing bottles, you know, changing diapers, all of those things. The active living goes on, I say. So it's hard to remember those who aren't here. What I came to doing, and it's also in the book, and I started this long before that Mother's Day, but like I would write her name in the shower every day, and I still do. And so I think we can parent them still in little acts of rituals that we can remember along the way. It doesn't have to be something large. I
Yeah.
also think too that, you know, it's kind of poignant, like Nora would have been, by the time this book comes out, she really would have been like 12. She'll be 12 this year. And that's kind of like when you send them off into their own individuation, right? So I don't know. That kind of means something to me too.
Do you find that some years are harder than others? Like when she would have been hitting like certain milestones, like the first, I found when Jasmine would have been 5 last year, I found that really hard, like the year that she would have been starting school. So like, do you find any year particularly harder or?
Yes, I think kindergarten is always a hard one, right? But for me, to be honest, I kind of miss that because Nora was my first. Like, I didn't think much about kindergarten because I didn't have a kid in kindergarten yet. So, but when Zoe went to kindergarten, I was the following year because she's a year behind Nora. I was like, oh, this is how old Nora would have been, or we would have done this last year. And then a sadness sinks in. It's also in the book. I have a cousin a close cousin who had a baby at the same time as I did 2 weeks before Nora. It's a boy. and I had moments in the book where I talk about witnessing him grow up and her kind of forever being stuck as a baby. And even now, like I see him and all the activities he does. And it's interesting it's like a cognitive dissonance to be like, I am supposed to have a kiddo in 5th grade, like that just, I don't know. It's a weird thing to hold. I don't know if you feel the same way.
Yeah, that is really hard. Sometimes I was in actually a group from the bump with like people that were due at the same time as me, like when Jasmine was born. And so I'm still part of that group, but then it's really hard to be in there sometimes when everyone's like, okay, let's post pictures of all the birthday kids. And I'm like, oh, and I just have, the few pictures I have of Jasmine from when she was born. Like that's all I get. So
Yeah.
those are kind of hard.
Yeah. And I think it's just, yeah, I would agree. It's hard. I don't know really what to say about it. It's just a weird experience.
It is. Yeah. And I feel like a lot of lost parents I know feel the same way. I mean, we don't have, we have all the pictures we have, or for some people, we have no pictures, so especially if maybe you had like an early loss, you may just have a positive test. You may have never had an ultrasound picture, it makes them feel like it's not real.
Yeah, so there's a word for that. It's called ambiguous loss. So like this idea of like I lost something, but I can't like put my fingers on what I lost, right? And sometimes that leads to disenfranchised grief. So the idea that like people don't identify our loss or don't see our loss. Not only do we not understand or we understand what we lost, but not only do we not aren't able to like put our fingers on it of what we lost, but people don't see my grief or my anguish around the babies that were supposed to be here. I mean, I talked about this in a different podcast. It's not going to come out till November, that I filmed last week, but the idea that like they blatantly asked me, and it was a hard question to answer, like what's the difference between a miscarriage and a stillbirth? And so research actually shows that because I don't know if people know this, I'm a psychotherapist that specializes in perinatal loss and the subsequent pregnancy now. So I do a lot of presentations on this, and research shows that it's not about the length of love or the length of pregnancy. It's about the depth of the connection, right? So the grief is the same no matter what. But what happens, I feel like, for people who don't have pictures to share or didn't get to hold their baby in their hands is that people don't honor their grief as much as maybe they might honor mine because they saw me hold my baby in pictures. So that would be disenfranchised grief, right? Like not acknowledging the pain of what people have lost. And I see that a lot with my miscarriage clients and my early loss clients.
Yeah, I've actually was not familiar with that term, but I like that term. It makes a lot of sense for, what happens a lot to a lot of people in the community.
Yeah.
So you said, go ahead.
I was just going to say we need to be better about that.
Yes, definitely. We always talk about how language is very important. And, I think a lot of people, maybe if they've never been through loss, they don't understand how much their words matter and what they say or don't say.
Yeah, for sure.
So what was it after you lost Nora? Is that when you switched to specializing in like the perinatal loss, or did you do some of that before?
No, so like I did, maybe I mentioned this. I was a chemical and alcohol or sorry, how am I say this? I was a sobriety therapist, like a substance abuse clinic is what I worked at. And we focused on sobriety and mental health when I was pregnant with Nora and the 2 children that came after her. And then after I had gotten through like all my own stuff, and my own therapy, like I talked about for 3 years, which my therapist is very much in the book, and my therapy sessions around my grief. Then I felt like I was able to finally hold space for other people going through similar things in the perinatal period. And that's what I do now. So when Leah was like, when I went back to work after maternity leave with Leah, so in August 2016, I switched specialties. And he'll be 8 soon. So 8 years of doing it, I guess.
Wow. Do you ever feel like burned out from other people's grief ever? Like the grief, like too much grief, or you have a good handle on it?
So because I took so long to work through my own stuff, which I think is important, in order to hold other people's stuff, I don't feel burned out by it. It's actually one part of my life I don't feel burned out by. I think grief is actually quite beautiful, and in my book I describe it as love. Like it's heartbreaking and brutal and creates a lot of anguish. And it's not the pain that connects of grief that connects us to people that we've lost. It's just the love, and the love is why we're sad, right? And so if we can hold grief in that way, others in our own, it's a quite beautiful experience. You don't have to do a lot to support someone in grief. You just have to be kind, and you have to be present, and you have to hold space for them and hold their world as they see it and validate that. And over time, grief will do what it needs to do to you in a healing way if you let it. So I find it one of the privileges of what I get to do.
I think that's an amazing way to look at it. I mean, a lot of people I think are kind of scared by death and grief, and like, oh, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to handle this. Like, I'll just do nothing, or I'll just, they just kind of freak out about it.
That's because we live in a death denying culture, right? So like we don't like to talk about death. We don't even like to talk about aging, like we outsource our elderly once they get too sick, which I don't agree with. We outsource death. Once people die, we no longer take care of the bodies of our loved ones in our home. Like all of those things we used to have more interaction with. And so death was looked at as scary, but different, right? Like it was just something that occurred. It was a part of life. It was a certainty. But now we have no framework for that. And so it's created this anxiety, this death anxiety, even more so. And I hope not to do that with my kiddos. I don't know how you do it, but I like to talk about how, like we talk about Nora, but I also like to talk about how to talk to children about losing a baby or losing a sibling, because it impacts them, right? Like Zoe and Leah's story wouldn't exist without Nora. So my kids from the beginning have known that someone came before them, which is the name of the book we use to teach them. But there's so many great books out there now that help kids learn about grief. There's that new one by Kids Grief Support, Jessica. Have you gotten that book yet?
I haven't yet, but I just heard about it the other day. So I definitely have it on my list to get.
Oh, it's beautiful. It's like the ABCs of grief. I don't know if I'm saying it right, so maybe we can quote it in the podcast, but each page has this beautiful illustration about like what grief is like by going through ABCs. And it's even great for adults, right? Like, so teaching kids that grief is normal, I think can help us change the narrative for the next generation. And then another book I really liked is The Perfectly Imperfect Family. Did you have that book?
I didn't have that one either.
Oh, that one's really cute because it talks about, it's also written by a friend. It talks about how a baby passed away before the two siblings. And then it goes through all the different ways that they still include her in their family life, like at birthday parties or holiday celebrations or like remembrance rituals. So that they know that they had a sibling that came before them, which I think is so important because again, like I said, we can change the narrative around how we kind of incorporate life and death as we move forward in the world for the next generation.
Do you find that as your kids get older, do they have like more questions about what happened or harder questions at all?
I think kids ask harder questions the older they get, no matter what. I think we've talked about it so much that it's more of just the story has been integrated. Nora's picture is up in our house. It's interesting. Nora had this one elephant stuffy that actually, if you read the book close enough, you'll hear all these things that I'm envisioning her holding when I'm telling her the story, because it's her one stuffy that we've had in like all the family photos that represent her when we take photos. And over time, it would sit on the shelf, and my daughter Zoe has her own Lullaby that she's always loved. But when she around like 5 or 6, Zoe started sleeping with both. We call it Nora, like the stuffy is named Nora. And now Nora is a part of her ritual every night. And I didn't encourage that. It just happened. So in some ways they incorporate it on their own. Leah does ask questions because he's a pretty smart cookie. And recently he started realizing, like, would you have had me if you wouldn't have had Nora? And that's a hard question to hold, right? I actually contemplated a lot at the end of the book, because we have Leah by the end of the book, because we had always planned on having 2 kids and not 3, and life doesn't go the way you plan, right? But he wonders about that, and my answer is like, I just wish you all could be here, and I'm so glad you're here.
That is definitely a tough question.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of the book, it's talked about directly in the book, like holding the both and I think, when life happens before, or death happens before life, like what stillbirth is, we do contemplate life and death more, and we have to figure out how to hold space for all realities that could have been and all loves that you have. And when you do that by saying, I really wish all of you could be here, right? I miss Nora, and I'm so glad that you're here, Leah.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect answer, because we want them all here. I don't want to think about life without my living kids here, or I don't like to think about life without having Jasmine here. It just is my reality. But
exactly. Yeah. So that's why it's good to have resources to talk to kids about grief about.
Yeah, I need to get those books.
They're
I'm
great.
slacking in the book department over here.
Oh, I love books. That's why. So, but yeah, we could include them in a resource guide.
Yeah, definitely. Are
Fun.
there any other resources, books, or anything that you found helpful, or that you find helpful now? Since I know you said there weren't a lot of resources after you lost Nora.
I would say there was a lot of resources on grief and loss, and a lot of great memoirs. Like my favorite is The Exact Replica of a Figment of My Imagination. That book helped me so much. Did you ever read that one?
I think I did read that one.
Yeah, by Elizabeth McCracken. That one helped me so much in my early days of grieving, and it's in my book. Like every book that helped me along the way is in my books. It's called bibliotherapy, when you rely on books to help you get through hard things. But I think even compared to mine, I think that's like the best memoir on stillbirth and the subsequent pregnancy out there still. Any books that I recommend most often? I recommend Dr. Jessica Zucker's I Had a Miscarriage to a lot of my miscarriage clients, and just clients in general, to see that they're not alone, no matter what type of loss they have, because in her story, she talks about it as her own loss, but also being a reproductive psychotherapist and hearing the stories of other people's losses along the way. And so finding that relatable. I'm trying to think. Oh, there's this book I recently read. Oh, I'm going to butcher it. What's it called? A Heart That Works, which is by a dad. Have you read that book?
I haven't heard of that one yet.
That one is actually, it's a famous comedian and TV producer, writer. And his second son gets diagnosed with, I think it's cancer. I don't remember, but a horrible illness when he's like 18 months or 2 months old, or 2 years old. And then it's about their journey of trying to get him healthy, and then also trying to realize that he's not going to live a long life. It's one of the most beautiful books, and humorous, if that makes sense, dark humor and relatable books on child loss that I've read from a dad perspective, along with Vessels. Vessels is written from a dad's perspective. It's very beautiful, around the stillbirth of his child.
I feel like there's not a lot of resources from dads in general.
There's getting to be more, but we do need to hear that voice more often. Right. So like in my book, I talk about my husband's journey a lot because he gave me permission to share it. Like I really threw myself into writing and therapy as a form of processing and holding space for my grief. And he was running marathons and threw himself into running. So I think, we process grief differently than our partners a lot of times. And I do think we need to hold more space for hearing the partner's perspective.
Oh, marathons. That's not anything I could ever do.
I'm not, we don't talk about how they pan out, but he was a finisher. Let's just say that.
Hey, that's all that matters, right? is the effort and the trying. So is there anything else that you'd like to share or add?
It's taken me a long time to think. I think if you're supporting a bereaved person in your life from pregnancy and infant loss or child loss, it's just important to remember to hold space for them. Like we kind of mentioned, like I do, like be kind, maybe research a little bit about what to say versus what not to say. text them and say, I'm thinking of you. Bring them food. Just do something for them without making them do the labor of having to figure out what that something is. Include their babies in conversation, use their name, and remember them on holidays, hard holidays and anniversaries, like Mother's Day is coming up. Remember them on Mother's Day, remember them on Father's Day, and remember all their children. And if we lead from a place of kindness and compassion in others in grief, they'll feel more welcomed. I do talk in the book about how there is no one word for the bereaved parent, which is interesting within itself, right? There's widow, widower, orphan, but there's nothing for the bereaved parent. And I think until we come up with something, sometimes bereaved parents are often disenfranchised. We don't acknowledge their unimaginable loss. And so if we could just acknowledge it a little bit more, I think that would go a long way.
Yeah, definitely. I think just hearing my daughter's name, or just, knowing that she's remembered, that's all you have to do. Like, you don't have to do something grand and giant, just say her name.
Yeah, exactly. I love that.
And so if people are interested in buying your book, where would they go to buy that?
Any place good books are sold. So there's a link on my website to 3 sellers, but it's most likely at your nearest bookstore, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, independent bookstores, whatever works for you.
Well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Lindsey, for talking with me today and sharing your story and about your new book. I'm in the process of reading and can't wait to finish it. It definitely makes me super emotional to read, though. Don't forget to go out and purchase your copy of the book. You definitely won't want to miss out on reading it. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. If you like the show, please leave a review or rating on Apple or Spotify. It only takes a moment and really helps the show reach more loss and infertility families. Thank you so much for tuning in, and remember, we are all in this together.